Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Museum of Fly Fishing. My name is Jim Schottenham. I'm joined by Scott Biron, and we're coming to you from the campus here in Manchester, Vermont, of the American Museum of Fly Fishing. And in fact, we're outside right now in the midst of the 17th annual Fly Fishing Festival here at the museum. And today we're going to be providing you with another edition of Streamer Time with Scott Biron. Scott's on the HMH staff. He's also an AMFF ambassador, and Scott's been tying a couple of these webinars for us. And I think today's topic is one that certainly interests me. I think this is fascinating history. We're going to be talking about one of the first, if not the first, streamer fly and the origins of that fly and the men that were involved in its inception. So Scott, let's talk a little bit about who these people were and how they were involved in it.
Right. So we had three of these individuals. We had two brothers, Gene Letourneau and Emile Letourneau. Gene was a writer for Garand Press up in Maine, and he had a column every week in the local paper, kind of a fishing game column. And they were paired up with another fellow who was a chiropractor in the town of Waterville in that area, Maine, by the name of Herbert Sanborn. And these guys were hardcore anglers. They documented almost everything they caught, the water temperature. They were always on top of like how fast the boat was moving. And it got to the point where Gene actually wrote a small pamphlet, which the museum has a copy of, on streamer fishing. And it's still good. There's stuff in it that you could use if you'd never trolled before, but these guys were, had the trolling piece down. And they had a small dilemma. They had found that over time, as they were fishing, they were getting a lot of short strikes, which was meaning that the feathers on most of the long hook streamers would extend well beyond the rear of a hook. And these fish would come up and they would strike the back and they would never hook up. And so they were frustrated with that. And we've done a significant amount of research on this. And our first blush was that they came up with a tandem fly that had two hooks with a piece of gut or a piece of tinsel. And if you think of tinsel today, it's mylar, but back then it was metal.
Right.
So it was much stronger, and they would hold the hooks together.
Now, let me interrupt. When they were doing that, these were standard shanked hooks that they used to lash together. And then when they did that, the first attempt at some of these flies with those two shorter shanked hooks, it really didn't solve their problem necessarily, did it? Because the fly's feathers extended beyond that rear hook.
Right. They were really struggling with that. And so what they ended up doing was they started with a streamer hook on the front. And I'll show you, if you can see this, there's a long streamer hook. Look at my fingers, between my fingers there. But there's another set of hooks on the back. This is not one that they used, but that what they ended up with, coming up with, is this double hook. Eventually, what we're going to use today is a wire to hold them together. But if you look at the rear part of this hook, you'll see that the feathers are right there. This allowed them to extend this to match the smelt that they were trying to imitate.
Right.
So if the smelt were, 8 inches, they could make this an 8 inches exactly. They couldn't do that with a standard hook. They would have had feathers back here, and they would have never hooked up a fish.
Yeah.
So they came up with this. It took them a little bit. They used a streamer hook on the front and then a smaller streamer hook on the back. And they ground the head of the back one off the eye. And they did a lot of gymnastics to get it to work. But eventually what they ended up doing was getting wet fly hooks, which we'll show you today. Stout, strong hooks that could handle it, and the wire that was used to hold them together. this allowed them a lot more flexibility. And these guys, the Letourneau brothers, were so convinced that this was going to work that they actually took this pattern, the Sportsmen Say, and tried to patent it with the U.S. Patent Office.
So a couple of things of note here. Number one is that you mentioned Gene earlier. Gene would write about these adventures and their trials and tribulations in his column, Sportsmen Say, which in itself was unusual because the salmon fishing and streamer fishermen, by and large, were somewhat secretive. They weren't really, it wasn't the norm to share all of your information. Gene was a departure. He was all about sharing information, encouraging others to get out there on the water and be successful. And the other thing that I think is important is Scott a number of times would use they did this, they did that, because the origin and the first person to actually tie the tandem streamer is in some circles still debated. Was it Dr. Sanborn? Was it Emile Letourneau? Did they fish together? Did they come up with this idea on their own? Gene had an opinion, but apparently Dr. Sanborn had a different opinion.
Yeah, we really burnt down on this. And what we originally read and researched was that it was Emile's fly that was the first one.
Sure.
But when we looked at some correspondence that Sanborn had written in some publications, some books, book on flies by Edson, he wrote a letter that basically said, no, this was my idea. Emile was in the boat, but he had to get out early. And I actually fished with the tandem first, and it was my idea. And then Emile went back and kind of modified it, and they came back with the Sportsmen Say. Sanborn wasn't fishing with the Sportsmen Say. He was fishing with the 9-3.
So let's talk a little bit about the 9-3. It's kind of an interesting name. Obviously, most fly patterns have Royal Coachman, caddis fly. What's the origin of the 9-3?
So the 9-3 was the weight of the first salmon that they caught on the tandem.
Okay.
It was
Simple enough.
9 pounds, 3 ounces. And it was hooked in daylight and landed well after dark because it was such a big fish. And it was done with the 9-3 tandem, which is a totally different fly than the Sportsmen Say. And we'll show you a little bit about it. I have one here. They do not, and Sanborn wrote about this, they do not look pretty in the when they're dry. And they're not supposed to.
Bring that up just a little bit so folks can see.
So when you look at this, the wind is not helping us here. It's blowing the wing all around. But you have 3 green feathers that sit flat right on top of the tandem hooks, like my hand. And then on top of the green, you have 2 black feathers that sit right on top, like a traditional feather wing.
Sure.
There's a little white bucktail underneath those feathers, and it's dressed with some silver tinsel. This action, when it's wet, gives it a swimming action because you have the black moving back and forth, looking like a smelt swimming. And if I probably did my research and asked all the anglers I know, this is probably the second most popular fly in Maine, next to the gray ghost.
Okay.
And Sanborn was not happy. He felt this is the way to tie this fly, but everybody except for Emile tied the fly traditionally, like this one that's here. The wings are tied flat. So you have the green wings inside with the black wings on the outside. The action is not nearly what it is when you put this fly in the water. And smelt in Maine have a dark line on that goes over their back. And right there is exactly what they look like.
So it's safe to say that Dr. Sanborn really focused in on the action of the fly not just pure aesthetics. He was interested in getting the fly out to the public, but he wanted people to be successful, and having that action was critical to success. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yep.
All right, so you're going to show us one
Yeah.
of the
So
patterns today.
let's put one up. We're gonna use some hooks here that are the back hook traditionally on today's. I'm just gonna adjust this a little
Get
bit.
there in
You
it.
can see it,
I'm
yeah.
going to move out of the way.
So on today's tandems are wet fly hooks, stout wet fly hooks, and the back hook is always a 4 and the front hook is always a 6. So it's this one's got the back, and if you've heard me do one of these before, you've heard me say that I always use white thread. This is the one fly that I always use black thread on because it's mostly covered. And I'm just going to get a nice little thread base on here. And then what I'm going to use is there's a bunch of different materials that you can use to connect it. Berkeley makes some steel on, which has stainless steel wire with a little plastic coating on the outside. The thread bites into the coating. It's really good. This is Mason multi-strand 60-pound test stainless steel wire. This is what I use. This is what really works. It doesn't bend, kink when you catch, a lot of fish. You want these flies to hold up. And so what I do is I cut these. You get a nice little ruler like you had in your first grade, and I cut these 2 1/4 inches long. That's the length of this. I could make it longer. I really wouldn't make it much smaller. And then what I do is I just slide the wire in along the shank of the hook through the eye. And then I lay it in there. And you got to be careful because the thread doesn't like the steel. It can break it. And once I get a little bit of a bead on there, then I get some Zap-A-Gap. And I just put a little dab of it on either side. This is really going to lock that wire in place. And if you rub it in to the thread, it's going to make it nice and strong. And then I bring it all the way back. And I take mine off the wire. So I'm now on bare hook. And you can use Mylar for this. And you can use number 12 or number 10, a medium or a large. This is a 12. I tuck it in place. And then I wrap forward. And then I wrap one wrap off on the bare hook. And then I start with a little bit of an overlap. Now this Zap-A-Gap is gonna lock this in. If this fly starts to come apart because you caught 30 or 40 fish, it's the one thing that's not gonna fall apart is the Mylar that's on this shank. It's gonna stay there without a problem because that Zap-A-Gap's gonna hold it in place. That's essentially the rear of the hook, all set. Now, today, we're not going to let a lot of things dry. But what I would do is build up the head like I'm doing now. Make sure I got all the silver covered. And I would do a whip finish. Now, tandems, you need a bigger whip finish, a longer one. You got to cover a little bit more real estate around that wire. And I'm going to only do one on this one, but I would always do 2, 3 turn whip finishes to really lock it in. And then I would lacquer that head probably 3 times. Once that's done, I just kind of do a little bit of adjustment here to make sure it's lined up correctly. Take it out. And now I'm gonna put the larger hook in the front. This is the number 4. And essentially I just do the exact same thing. Only when we put the wire in place on this one, we're gonna lay it on top, not underneath. Now, if you are familiar with tandems, you'll see a lot of times, you'll see the tandem will have the front hook orientated like this. And the back hook will be riding up like that. This is how a lot of tandems were built. And they were hoping that when they were dragging these down deep in the water, that they wouldn't hook on anything on the bottom. However, if the salmon or the brook trout hits the front of the fly and tries to attack it, a lot of times that back hook turned up would come around and nail them in the eye and basically end up killing the fish over time. So I always have both mine down. And if you look at the Emile Letourneau's, or I've seen a photograph of one of Sanborn's flies, they're all down. Back hook is down. So I do the same thing here. Couple wraps. And then hit it with the zap again. Now, a lot of people ask me about using UV resin on this and stuff. The resin is fine if you want to, I'm allergic to it. But if you use resin, one thing we've noticed with trolling flies in the spring is that the water is so cold, the resin will cool right off the head of the fly or off the body. So we stayed away a little bit from the resin. You know, if you use lacquer, not water-based head cement, and same thing, bring it up. And then we're wrapping the front body. Now, you guys also have to think about a couple things here. I think Letourneau, Sanborn, were probably tying the flies just for them and their buddies. But the other tires that were producing flies for shops, they were tying to make money. And because of that, they were looking for every shortcut they could possibly have. And that's why I think you see on this fly that they stopped, the production tires stopped putting them with the wing flat on the bottom. And we're going to tie it the way it's supposed to.
You're going to tie it, Dr. Sanborn.
Yes, he would be happy. He's looking down at me right now. Hopefully I'm saying the right things here. So I'm going to take a little bit of Bucktail. Now, one of the cool things about Sanborn and Letourneau is, like I said, they were hardcore. They got into this. And they had devised a little bit of a theory that in the spring, they would use the white bucktail heavy, more white bucktail than they would use as the water warmed up in the summer. So we're going to kind of go half and half here. Just going to get it stacked up a little bit. You need nice long bucktail for this. And then I'm just going to cull out some of the short ones. You don't need a lot. Sparse is better. When bucktail gets wet, it looks bigger than it is in real life, and you don't want to overdress your fly. So I'm going to lay it in there. I want it to come just about to the back bend of the hook. Put a little wax on my thread and just moderately lay it in there in position. Once I have it positioned where I want, I can move forward and lock it in place. If you want, you can take your thumb and just roll it, and it's going to lay it right in there. Then we would take just a tad bit of the lacquer. Thin lacquer is going to dry in no time. while I'm getting the next piece ready. So the next piece is the green wing. So we take these saddles here by Ewing, and with most feather wing jet, if you have a 4 hackle fly, you have to take 2 from the right side and 2 from the left side. Because this is a flat wing, you can take them from anywhere you want. And I already picked these off, and I tried to get them in a shape that was pretty consistent. So they almost all match. The best spot to take them from for a 9.3 is right up the middle, right in here. The other thing I want to share about this green is there is a lot of controversy with the green, but we got a frame of Emile Letourneau's flies, and one of them is a 9.3, and this is the color of the green. And I think this is the truest color that we've seen. The photo I saw of Sanborn's fly had this green as well. So this moves pretty quick. I just have to kind of be careful about the wind because it's running havoc with everything. So I lay one on top, mark the length. And then if you've seen one of these webinars before that I've done, I just kind of trim it. So I have about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of bare stem. And then I just repeat that with the next 2. Now, one thing that I never was able to figure out is if they tied each one of these in individually or if they tied these in as 3 at once. Thread back then would have probably been monocord that they were using, which was a thicker thread than what most people use today on streamers. And I think that for that reason, they probably tied them all in all together. The easiest way to tie these in is to glue them. And we use this fabric fusion, and we just put a little bit on the feather stem, about 1/4 inch into the feather, and we lay it on top. Try to line it up, press the stems together. Because this is 3, we got to put the 3rd one on.
Good catch in the wind.
Not bad. I was a PE teacher. I expected to catch it. And there's your wing right there. See how that lays right there? And you can see, you could steam these feathers if you wanted to so that they were perfectly straight when you laid them on top like that. But, you know, once they get wet, they're going to lay in there the way that Sanborn designed them to. So you don't really need to overthink it. Now, the next piece is to get your black saddles. So I already picked them out. I've kind of looked at these a number of times. And what I've seen in these flies that these 2 fellows tied was that the wing, the black wing, was slightly shorter than the green. So what I want to do is just measure my black just a little shorter. Now, why? Is it a big deal? Well, in a way it might be, because the black line that's on the smelt doesn't always extend all the way down to the tail. So then we just bang these 2 out. And we will glue these together. There is some controversy. Some of the books said there were only 2 green feathers, but Sanborn said there were 3. And I think that when you look at this and you're getting it from the horse's mouth, you might as well take it as gospel. And when we looked at the fly that the Letourneau sent us, that Emile had tied, it was 3 grain. Okay, so get a shot of water here. We've got the lacquer is set up. The green saddles are pretty much set and glued together. And we're gonna wax that thread again. Lay them in place. And just put a couple loose wraps. And as I go forward, I'll snug it up a little bit. And you can twist it. There are some people that will try to take and they'll crush the stems, flatten them a little bit, but that really weakens it. Then we lay those black ones in place. They just sit right on top. Oh, isn't that a beautiful thing? And you can see with the wind just blowing a little bit, you can see how that top wing is starting to move around. Now, the last piece that they used on these is the jungle cock eyes. And they would take these, strip them down, and lay them on that black wing. Now, what I would suggest is that if you want these to last more than 2 fish, you would take some of that fabric fusion and put it on the back of the jungle cock so that it would stick to that black wing. But because I have so much stuff here that's wet, I'm not going to introduce anything more, but I'm going to lay it in there. And that gives you a nice, like, looks like the gill plate throat of a smelt. Then it's really important with this particular pattern that the wind cooperates. And you kind of snip it off the waist in not all 5 stems, but try to snip them off no more than 2 at a time. Then start at the front of the head, right behind the eye of the hook, and work yourself back. Always with streamers, start at the eye, because you don't want it to roll off the little ledge from where you cut your stem. And once you get that bullet shape, you're going to be able to really lock everything in. And then what I do is I counterclockwise spin my thread. This is Danville. And I whip finish forward And when I counterclockwise spin it, I'm getting it flatter. And it really is going to give you a nice, smooth head. With salmon, they a lot of times will hit the front hook to attack it, try to hurt that smelt, and then they'll circle around back and they will attack the back feather, and end up hooking up on that rear hook. That's often what you see. And the Letourneau, Gene, in his book, wrote a lot about keeping his fly rod when he was trolling in the fly rod hole. And what he was theorizing was that that salmon would hit the front hook, and most people would yank that fly rod and pull the fly right away from the fish. By the time he reached for the rod holder, it had hit, circled around back. He had the rod in his hand when it hit the back fly. So that's a 9.3. And this tandem was really changed because every fly that was being made in Maine at the time could now be fashioned any size that you wanted. And this was really why the Letourneaus wanted to get it patent. The patent office said, no, sorry, too many variations in flies, but they were convinced that it was going to work.
Sure. And it has worked for all these years.
Yeah, like I said, I would say most people would say that's the second most popular fly.
Yeah. Which, and behind the gray ghost.
The gray ghost, which has been around for 100 years.
Not bad company to be in. So here we have the trio of men, Dr. Sanborn, Gene Letourneau, Emile Letourneau. Whose story do you want to take into consideration and accept this fact? But certainly all three of these gentlemen were instrumental in developing the tandem fly.
Definitely, and they documented, and that's where, we talk a lot about, who tied this fly? How do we know? They wrote it down. Multiple places with the same information. We're confident that this was probably the first tandem, and the Sportsmen Say was the second tandem. They're tied almost identically, except for that flat wing's not there. Same sparse material, different color, but this was the one that I think we can feel confident going to bed tonight that was the first tandem fly.
Terrific. Well, Scott, thank you for coming by as always.
No,
we
anytime.
appreciate everybody watching the webinar today. Of course, we got very lucky with the weather today. It's cooperated except for a little bit of wind. I hope everyone's enjoyed this. Of course, Scott will be back doing another webinar on a streamer fly in the future. And certainly hope that you've enjoyed these webinars. It's a beautiful day here in Manchester. If you've not been to the Fly Fishing Festival here, I strongly recommend you come by. We have a number of tires here. There's a tremendous number of vendors here with everything from antique gear to contemporary gear. There's people here giving fly casting lessons. We've had a fly casting contest, raffles. It's a great energy here today. And I hope everyone watching will be compelled to come next year. So with that, we're going to say good afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.